Kawere, welcome to Born Extinct, my journey to the acknowledgement of my ancestors and authentic spiritual self. My name is Atakwa, and I was born extinct. Khoi and San human remains have become prisoners of science. My ancestors were the most ridiculed indigenous people in the world. Particularly degrading and dehumanizing are the images of their genitalia, dissected and exhibited all over the world. Sexual organs of the Khoi and San was of particular interest to the European. The curiosity of our low evolutionary status and the sexual depravity of the inferior race resulted in the sanctification of the black body and the invention of the savage. During the scramble for Africa's wealth, art was arguably one of the highest costs of colonial plunder. European superiority theory was married with enactments of life in the colonies. Displays at art fairs became a regular feature on the European cultural calendar. Creations of entire African villages, complete with dances, allowed Europeans a view of our primitive living in the colonies. By grouping together Khoi and San with elements of nature, they portrayed our ancestors as others, placed outside of humankind in the colonial crime scene, pseudoscience, and the theory of races. Promoting racial sciences through displays such as museums, zoos, universities, and world fairs positioned us as an inferior race. The aim of these exhibitions were to create the other, legitimizing European domination. Keeping our ancestors imprisoned in vaults and boxes is an ongoing form of spiritual control over previously colonized people. During this period of global spectacle, the South African Museum was one of the most active participants in the making of casts for the European market. Victorians, through mummy unwrapping parties, caricatures of British and French aristocratic fantasy, while enjoying sensationalist defilement, dismemberment, and the displaying of skulls of indigenous people. From the 1800s, our ancestors' remains were subject to race science. Ironically, it was Hitler who put a stop to these disgraceful European displays. The call for the return of stolen human remains is a very uncomfortable topic for the European elite who made their fortunes by holding on to these human remains and plundered artifacts. The South African Museum and the vaults of the University of Cape Town hold some 9,000 boxes of human remains hidden and locked in vaults and storerooms. Some are believed to be many thousands of years old, while others have living descendants. The South African McGregor Museum have record of the gruesome details of commissioning people to rob and desecrate new graves of Khoi. Many of the conquered, captured, and lured indigenous people died during the voyage to Europe or shortly after arrival in these torturous places of captivity. Visitors to these zoos were allowed to throw coins and stones and food at them. Children were allowed to poke them with sticks, and for an extra fee, grown-ups were allowed to subject our ancestors to the most vile and degrading acts. Zoos hosted living exhibits of indigenous people from Africa, Asia, South America, and Oceania. where they lived in zoological replicas of their villages. Human zoos were spectacularly involved in the creation of the shift from scientific to popular racism. Among the most prized curiosities were the tattooed heads of the Maori. The grim trade began in 1870 and was banned 50 years later, but too late for the hundreds that were sold to museums in Europe and North America. Museums have been part of human history for more than 2,000 years and played an essential role in African civilization. This tradition started in Black ancient Egypt at a time when Europeans were still displaying flora and exotic animals. The Black Moors were the first to establish curiosity cabinets in Europe after centuries of their ignorance. The study of the natural world was encouraged when they conquered parts of Europe after the Dark Ages. Since the 1500s, European museums have been filled with human remains and artifacts stolen from African, Asian, and Australian communities. The majority were produced through violent conflict. When archaeology was first established, thousands of graves in the colonies were simply dug up, excavated, and its contents shipped to Europe to please the ever-growing appetite for primitive arts. This saw the emergence of art collectors and art dealers. By the late 1800s, all major cities, including Paris, London, Warsaw, Berlin, Milan, Antwerp, Barcelona, Hamburg, had human zoos. The World Fair for Human Zoos in Paris in 1831 was visited by over 34 million people. Prior to the 19th century, museums were small and open only to the aristocracy. With goods flooding in from all over the colonies, the unethical museum was born. The British Museum has 20,000 human remains in their collection. The museum was not originally created as a repository for looted artifacts. It was originally designed to promote and display science and ingenuity. The British Museum, Berlin State Museums, French National Museums, and the Metropolitan Museums of Art have been holding hundreds of thousands of skulls, skeletons, bone fragments, preserved heads and genitals, and other body parts. In 1990, American Congress passed the Native American Grave Protection Act, which saw the return of 1.7 million pieces of grave goods, 57,000 skeletons, and 15,000 sacred and communal art objects. This was followed by the signing of a joint declaration on the handling of colonial collections by 16 European states. In 2004, the British government passed the Human Tissue Act, allowing their national museums the power to move human remains out of their collections. Instead of returning the remains, the Natural History Museum started a campaign to convince Indigenous people of shared rights. In 2019, the Dutch National Museum of World Cultures agreed to return 375,000 stolen artifacts in their possession. In 2015, former President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe first demanded the return of the decapitated heads of the Chimurenga leaders that were shipped to England to signify British victory in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. The Maori and the Moriori, backed by the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa, have repatriated close to 500 skeletal remains